Hello, everybody. I'm Ron Waksman. This is the COVID-19 series of CRT on CRT Online. And today I'm fortunate to have a representative from the Food and Drug Administration, and I'll let them to introduce themselves individually. Dr. Bram Zuckerman.
Yes, good morning, Ron. And on behalf of the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, I'd like to thank you for an invitation to an important webinar. My name is Bram Zuckerman. I'm a cardiologist by background, and presently I'm the director of the FDA Office of Cardiovascular Devices. We regulate cardiovascular, cardiothoracic, surgical, and peripheral vascular devices in this office. I'm next going to turn to my colleague, Dr. Soma Kalb, who sees things from a broader perspective at FDA CDRH. Dr. Kalb?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Bram. My name is Soma Kalb. I'm the Director for Division of Clinical Science and Quality in CDRH's Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, which oversees the programs related to evidence generation, including data analysis and policy and programs. And I'm a biomedical engineer by training.
Thank you, Soma. And
You're
we
welcome.
have also with us Andy Farb.
Hi, thanks, and it's great to be with you all. I'm Andrew Farb. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at CDRH, and I'm involved with the staff, the divisions for the review of cardiovascular devices at FDA.
So thank you, all of you. And maybe I'll start with you, Soma, if you want to give us a little bit an overview. How is the FDA, specifically CDRH, works during the pandemic? Are all services available? What is not done during the pandemic? If you give us a little bit an overview so our audience would understand how FDA works during this pandemic, which related to medical devices.
Sure, thank you. So generally, yes, daily activities are continuing, such as pre-market reviews, post-market surveillance and compliance actions. Things across the total product life cycle are continuing, although some things are not. So for example, domestic and foreign sponsor and study site inspections have been temporarily postponed while we're responding to the public health needs during the pandemic. And so only conducting mission critical inspections where it's possible because there may be disruptions at clinical sites. In addition to our regular work that has generally continued, the COVID-19 response has brought on new and different activities to try to support availability of medical products needed during the pandemic, from ventilators to personal protective equipment to diagnostic tests. These all fall under CDRH's purview. So in addition to the review of these products by our device-specific offices, our efforts include staffing hotlines to address sponsor inquiries and also providing guidance on various topics. It remains an evolving and very dynamic environment in which our work related to COVID-19 takes priority. Maybe I can turn it over to Bram to describe how things are in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices.
Thank you, Soma. Fortunately, in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices, we've been able to maintain full work capacity during the pandemic. The only change has been that our staff is doing 100% telework to increase staff safety.
Bram, so let me ask you a question. I understand that the pre-IDE meetings or meetings with sponsors still being conducted, but they can be done via the telehealth system. I mean, you're issuing web facilities to handle those?
Yes, so everything now is done via WebEx, but all programs that are important for the functioning of the Office of Cardiovascular Devices are running. Let me turn to Soma to explain a little bit more about the PreIDE program, which we now call the pre-sub program, and how to best implement it during this emergency. Soma?
Sure. Thank you. So just for background, pre-IDE meetings are those meetings held between sponsors and the FDA to address questions that they might have about their future clinical study. So an IDE, or investigational device exemption, is the term to describe the application submitted by sponsors to FDA to conduct a clinical study. So as Bram mentioned, they're now called pre-submissions, not necessarily pre-IDEs, because we do support discussions prior to any marketing submission or request for a clinical study. And so the program is broad, and they include options for receiving feedback just in writing or also with a meeting. And so we're still having those meetings, as mentioned. However, in the interest of safety for FDA and our industry, we are leveraging technology to host teleconferences rather than in-person meetings with industry. All of them will be held as teleconferences through the end of June, and we'll continue to assess as time progresses and provide periodic updates on whether that is changing.
Thank you. And let me just clarify. So with respect to timeline, usually for submissions, not necessarily pre-IDE, not necessarily have a timeline, but real submission, FDA still keep the timeline per whatever is a submission, the 30 days, when it's the 30 days. I mean, that's still being kept, or because of the pandemic, there are some exceptions?
No. Fortunately, the agency has been able to operate at full capacity through the teleworking option. So currently, the agency is meeting all MDUFA goals, including the IDE timeline that you just referred to, Ron. And interestingly, the volume of submissions is similar to what it was a year ago. There's been no change in volume of submissions.
And that's good. I mean, that means that the industry is still working also probably.
Yes.
One of the questions that we are struggling among ourselves, those that design the trials and those that conduct the trials, how is the actually patients who are enrolled into the trials during the pandemic COVID-19 impacting or potentially can impact the outcomes? So this may be a question has two folds. One is, when we designed those trials, we never thought about adding into the case report form a COVID-19 line, yes, no. And that, again, having the disease, we know it could be devastated, and it may impact on overall the clinical outcome. And the other thing is the patients that we recruit may be more, I would say, urgent or emergent patients, as elective patients were not allowed in most hospitals during the period, and still many states do not allow to do elective cases. So there's some skew of more difficult patients into trials when this was not designed, when we made the assumptions of the sample size calculation, etc. So I don't know who wants to take this difficult questions, but I'm curious to know how FDA prepared for that.
This is a great question, and we're very glad that you've raised it, because right now we have a public health emergency, and these are some of the seminal questions that affect clinical trials, not just in the interventional cardiology world, but in all areas. For example, Andy and I participated several weeks ago in a heart failure collaboratory meeting where the same questions were raised, and the ways forward are being discussed right now. Let me give some general comments, and then Andy can provide more specifics. These are undoubtedly tough questions that weren't planned for. In general, we would like sponsors to come in early to the agency to discuss these problems with us so that prospectively clinical trials and most importantly statistical analysis plans can be altered in a reasonable fashion. We do seek to be flexible in our approaches, and perhaps Andy can give us a few more specifics here.
Yeah, so this is an area that we are at the sort of the beginning of the appreciation of the wide stream implications of trying to do clinical research during a pandemic. And as Bram said, we're trying to be realistic and flexible and understanding when it comes to addressing these questions, and appreciation that while we may look at and be involved with individual sponsors and individual groups of clinicians for a particular topic, lessons learned and the approaches to these problems are often transferable across other device areas. So when we think about this, we can separate the clinical trial into the phase of execution and the reasonable changes that might be done to those trials in an effort to salvage the quality of try to maintain the quality of the trial and the integrity of the data as much as possible. So hewing to the original trial design and analysis plan is desirable, but we understand that changes will need to be made. And the important thing here, again, I think as Bram mentioned, is to think ahead, be proactive, and then put into place changes that are necessary to protect patients and research staff, document those ahead of time. That will help preserve the quality of the trial and the validity of the data. So we understand that changes in study execution will be necessary, such that remote monitoring is perfectly reasonable and is appropriate, as opposed to asking patients to come to the clinical centers for follow-up, as well as certain testing methods that the audience is familiar with in certain trials that may need to be changed, such as 6-minute walk tests or 4-meter gait speeds that might be able to be done remotely with appropriate monitoring. And this is, perhaps an opportunity to develop some new approaches that we can carry forward post-pandemic to make data collection and trial execution more efficient and more patient-centered, making use of digital tools, vital signs applications, activity trackers, et cetera, that will be useful now, but may also be helpful as we go forward. We can expect that because of the pandemic, there'll be more out-of-window assessments and protocol deviations that cannot be helped in many situations, but it would be important to, again, document when those occur and to do the best we can to make sure that those changes don't impact the quality of the data coming out of the trial. There may be opportunities to use third-party home monitoring services, understanding that there'll be changes in the way patients treated by their physicians in the time of a pandemic because of the lack of availability of physician visits, or perhaps even the threshold for hospitalization that wasn't anticipated when the trial was designed, as well as behavioral changes on the patients themselves. For example, changes in their diet or compliance with medications or exercise programs, again, that may be reflected in the types and numbers of events that are occurring within ongoing trials that will impact the analysis. And then finally, but most importantly, now we're in a COVID-19 pandemic atmosphere. And so we didn't anticipate that, but there are changes to the case report forms to try to capture those appropriate fields related to the pandemic that may be important to understanding the outcomes of trials, such as infection, serologies, and COVID-19 symptoms that may be important, that would be important to collect in trials going forward to understand how the current pandemic may affect the trial results. So that's on the execution side, and then we turn to the analysis side, and what we've, what has been reported is that, the event rates may be quite a bit different from the event rates that were predicted when the trial was designed because of patients not reporting either missing data not being reported for events, or actually a change in the natural history because the patients are now in a current pandemic situation. So it might be more challenging to show study success when our predictions about the number and types of events are different than what we anticipated when designing this study. There may be lower than anticipated hospitalizations and procedure rates, but that might be balanced by increased out-of-hospital mortality events because patients' fears for coming to the hospital. Another large area is the quality of life metrics that we've been very much interested in and incorporating in our clinical trials over the last several years in a more patient-centered approach. And quality of life changes may occur in the setting of a pandemic that may be completely unrelated to their, for example, heart failure or ischemic heart disease, but more related to social distancing or an anxiety about COVID-19. So we need to take those into consideration in the appropriate trials where those are outcomes are a part of the primary or secondary endpoints. And again, trying to, once incorporating the information from case report forms, have an understanding of the patient population in these trials to the extent that they may have COVID-19 based on symptomatology, culture, testing results, or serologies. The next part of trials that should be looked at in terms of analysis is the known effect of COVID-19 that is disproportionately affecting certain populations, such as minority populations, the elderly, and also where patients are living. So patients that are recruited from hotspots that have a lot of COVID-19, we can expect more confounding secondary to the presence of the pandemic versus cooler areas that have a lower incidence of the disease. The next area is adjudication, a big challenge here because our definitions that were put into our protocols were in a pre-COVID-19 era. So having COVID-19 expertise on our adjudication committees is probably a good idea and help with the adjudication of events such as MI, recurrent hospitalizations, mortality, and whether those events could be related to COVID-19, happening with COVID-19, but not an active, having an active symptomatology, or completely unrelated. We are expecting a guidance from our statisticians of advice about statistical analysis plans and how to make these adjustments, doing analyses pre-COVID-19 versus post-COVID-19 in certain trials. And most importantly is to protect the study integrity as much as possible. For example, when we're making changes in protocols, making sure that if it's a blinded study, we maintain the blinding, we maintain the randomization as much as possible. So you can see that the implications of this are profound, but they are addressable if we do it correctly and do it more as a community as opposed to a one-off. So let me stop here and get some more feedback from you and others.
Yeah, this was, thank you very much. This was very extensive, and maybe I'll follow with two clarification questions. Being more specific, if I'm a sponsor today, would you advise me to submit changes to the protocol to capture all those issues related in the case report form, the permission to do a visit on a telehealth rather than in person, maybe to be flexible? Obviously, you cannot do an echo follow-up if you need to do an echo follow-up. So would you advise me to submit it now? And do I need to wait for the response until I resume the study, or this is just going to be documented? What's going to be the process here on a day-to-day? I mean, because it looks like everyone will have to change. The question how you materialize those changes. So what would be your advice, and what's going to be the implication once we send it? Should we wait 30 days? It's like considered to be only 5 days wait. If you can guide me on that one, please.
Great question. So Soma can begin by just saying a few things about the regulatory requirements, and then Andy can continue by indicating how this can be a very dynamic and interactive process with reviewers in our cardiovascular division. Soma?
Sure. And before I specifically talk about that, I do want to mention that the FDA, all the centers together, have put together a guidance document. It's called FDA Guidance on Conduct of Clinical Trials of Medical Products during the COVID-19 public health emergency. And this guidance document speaks at a high level, providing agency perspective on a lot of the questions that we're talking about today. And it also provides specifics that I'll discuss as well right now with the regulatory requirements for changes. The guidance document, it was issued in March 18th, and it has an email address on it, and we receive questions like the ones that are being raised today, and we take those questions and we end up finding ones that might yield generalizable knowledge, and we update the guidance with those questions periodically. It's been updated 3 times already, most recently on Monday. So I'd highly recommend referring to that guidance to get a sense of the thinking. But generally, we recognize that this is a very dynamic situation, and the guidance has as a core focus that the safety of trial participants and research staff is paramount. And so we understand that changes might need to be made very quickly and dynamically. And when they're being made to address imminent risk due to the pandemic, those changes can be made without prior approval from FDA, but they should be reported to FDA in a timely manner. And so understanding challenges, it may be necessary to compile all those protocol deviations together and send them at once and in a way that works with you. For more study-wide changes where the study integrity might be in question and you need feedback from FDA, you would submit a protocol change to FDA, and we can review those. And again, they would require approval before implementing. But there is always the opportunity to talk with the review divisions within FDA and get a sense for how things are going. And maybe I can turn it back over to Bram or Andy to talk about how to engage with FDA for those specific questions.
Right. I think there are regulatory requirements, but the key thing is to keep lines of communication open in this very dynamic and challenging environment. And Andy, do you have a few recommendations for doing that?
Yeah, I think we are, working remotely, but we are working and available for questions from from investigators, from the industry on a regular basis, either individually or with the teams to address larger issues. We've already engaged with several individual sponsors about their plans for individual trials that have been affected by the pandemic. So these things are ongoing right now. For a more general issue, I think when we're talking about important changes to statistical analysis plans are to document and pre-specify, and particularly in those discussions and development of these plans to make sure that it's done in the right way such that the data are protected and that changes to the protocols analysis plans are done without looking at data so that we know that as best as possible, we've protected the scientific integrity of the data. We do understand there'll be necessary changes here, but we don't want we want to preserve as much as possible from these research programs, as long as we understand why changes were made, why they were very appropriate under the circumstances, and how we can understand the data when we analyze it based on the inputs we had upstream that modified the protocol in a very reasonable fashion.
Thank you very much. I think the last segment of our discussion, I'd like to talk about opportunities. Obviously, every time we have a challenge or a crisis, we want to look on the silver lining or some opportunities that can come as a result of a difficult situation. So one would be maybe more clarification to things that we are wondering. Obviously, this pandemic right now poses a delay on execution of clinical trials. There is no doubt about it. With less patients enrolled, everybody recognizes it. So base case scenario, again, this is going to be delayed potential approval of devices that can be helpful to our patients. Now, I must say that working with the FDA and following the work, I would mention that over the last decade, there was a huge shift and progress and preparation of the grounds to move more from pre-marketing to post-marketing. And I wonder if, given the fact that we are now being more delayed on the pre-marketing era, there would be an opportunity to shift some of the considerations for conditioned approvals, still mandating to continue some studies on the more post-marketing. So is there anything that we can expect that there will be adaptation to the situation, not to delay the process, not because of anybody else? I mean, it's nobody's fault, not the investigators, not the patients, not the FDA, but it is a given situation. So Soma, maybe you want to take this and start and tell us if there is any way that we can even think about it or forget about it, don't even go there.
So, maybe I'll comment, the typical process by which devices are authorized for market depends on the risk of the device. There are different pathways which you may be familiar with. For moderate and high risk devices, the traditional pathways are the 510K, de novo, and pre-market approval or PMA pathways. And in general, we take a benefit risk approach in our approvals and clearances, and we do always consider opportunities to shift data collection from the pre-market to the post-market when appropriate. And we have also programs designed to help accelerate the availability of products that are considered breakthrough technologies. We have the Breakthrough Devices Program to accelerate the development and review of certain devices that provide for more effective treatment or diagnosis for life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. So those programs exist, and on a submission or device by device basis, we can certainly look at benefit risk and consider how we might shift things from pre-market to post-market. I also want to mention, during the pandemic itself, we are trying to address the emergency and access to devices. And while not an approval process, there are two mechanisms that allow for FDA to use maximum regulatory flexibility and greatly accelerate access to products when they're not available or they're in low supply. The two mechanisms, which you may have heard a lot about from FDA, are what are called emergency use authorizations and also guidances that we put out with enforcement policies. So once the HHS secretary makes a declaration that there's an emergency, we can consider requests for emergency use authorizations, and these allow unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of those products to be used in an emergency situation when there aren't adequate approved alternatives during the declared emergency. And we also can use what are called immediately in effect guidances that we put out that describe enforcement policies. So we've issued a number of them describing the conditions when we won't object to certain uses or design changes to currently legally marketed devices that are essential to the COVID-19 response. So those are two examples of mechanisms that we have for ensuring access and that's needed right now. Maybe I can turn it over to Bram to talk about any of those specific examples.
Yeah, I'd like to underline for the cardiovascular community the importance of Soma's comments. FDA realizes that right now we have a public health emergency, and consequently we are using emergency authorities to try to make available useful devices to hospitals and physicians. For example, a recent emergency use device approval that may be of interest to the cardiovascular community was one that occurred 3 days ago. It's called the ECO left ventricular ejection fraction algorithm. As you know, access to transthoracic echocardiography during this crisis has been limited for a number of reasons. This device uses a 12-lead EKG and a machine learning algorithm to screen for patients who either have an LVEF greater than 40% or below. It should be recognized that an emergency use approval rests on a body of evidence that's before the agency. Consequently, we don't have time to require the usual preclinical and clinical data necessary for a 510K or PMA approval. But in this COVID-19 emergency, we take that into account as well as the body of data before us, and we make a benefit risk decision. It's important also to recognize that FDA has issued immediately in effect guidances that again are of interest to the cardiovascular community because they relax the enforcement discretion that FDA will apply to certain manufacturers such that devices are more available. For example, there's a IIE for ECMO devices whereby manufacturers are able to make these devices more available and to really let hospitals and physicians better utilize their maximum capacity during the COVID-19 crisis.
These are really great examples. One question that crossed my mind. Hopefully this pandemic is not going to last much and this emergency crisis will be over. So what's going to be the status of those devices that were allowed to utilize during the emergency time? Would they require to go again through the whole rigorous workup like before, or they would already kind of grandfather, or they are required to collect data? I mean, how would you deal with something that already approved during the emergency state when you're coming back to normal? Soma?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the EUAs, they authorize the use of the products during the emergency, but they are not considered a formal approval or clearance. So in order for a manufacturer to market the device, they would need to submit a marketing application at that time, and can certainly leverage data and information that was obtained during the pandemic, and the actual evidentiary needs for that product to go to market would need to be considered.
So we can assure you at this time, Ron, that when we go back to normal operations, we're not going to, in 24 hours, indicate that all these devices must be removed. Hospitals, for example, are spending a lot of money on buying these devices. At the present time, the agency is thinking about the critical question that you've raised, such that there can be an orderly transition to more normal operations. In the interim, we would certainly encourage investigators in hospitals to acquire good data on these device uses, such that potentially the data can be used for our normal regulatory approval mechanisms.
That's what I thought. I think it's basically encouraged to continue to collect data on those devices, and probably maybe a last clarification. Some of those devices are not being released yet to usage, but they can be related to patients with COVID-19, and they would be implemented in a trial. So are those trials, the approval, the consideration, are they treated differently in terms of the timeline? Let's assume that we do want to try mechanical support devices they're approved, but in order to get labeling to those patients, I mean, you still need to submit an IDE or an exemption. And are we working through the same processes like in normal days, or there is a different route to work on those devices, primarily for COVID-19 patients, in more expedited fashion or accelerated fashion? Soma?
Sure. So devices that are commercially available already and are being used within their indication may not need an IDE, but would, a clinical study would need IRB review, of course. If it is for kind of a different use that's outside of the indication, it would come in under an IDE. And, as we mentioned earlier, we're operating the same way that we have been all along. These COVID-19 related products and work at the agency is a priority. Maybe I can let Bram or Andy speak to, the specifics for the cardiovascular devices.
Right. So I think our timelines for both interaction and approval of IDEs remain very good. We're meeting all medical device user fee goals. And as we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, when it is unclear what a sponsor might need in an IDE to address preclinical or clinical requirements, the use of the so-called pre-IDE or pre-sub meeting is required. Often, one just needs to pick up the phone to contact the appropriate team in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices to start the conversation. Even before the COVID-19 crisis broke, Ron, as you know, we were very interested in implementing more device-based research in the cardiogenic shock and mechanical support arena. So I think that this is something that can continue even during these difficult times.
Thank you very much. I think that our time is up, and it was my impression that you actually work nowadays harder than in normal days because you have to deal with the normal submissions and review, and in addition, all the COVID-related issues that we discussed over the past 35 minutes. So maybe I'll let you go back to your work and let me go back to my patients. But before we end, maybe we didn't touch on any important message that each of one of you want to tell to our viewers. Please tell us what is kind of a most important message that you want our viewers to know about it. So maybe I'll start with you, Andy, and then Soma and Bram. Andy?
So I think it comes down to our essential mission, whether we're in a pandemic or not, that is to make safe and effective medical products available to patients. And to do that, we consider the totality of the data and apply benefit risk. And those things are taken very seriously. And those are not hard, they are the principles that we apply to the individual device, the clinical condition, and now in these times of a national emergency. So the good news is that we have the tools available, I think, to adjust to the times and be able to make products available that can help physicians to treat their patients, and that we are reasonable and flexible as much as possible to fulfill our mission.
Thank you. Soma?
Yeah, part of our mission is helping to support the public during this pandemic. And I think we are trying to put out as much guidance and information out there to be as transparent as possible throughout the pandemic. I would really like to encourage folks to look at the guidance that I mentioned, and also to see the scope of feedback and input that we're trying to provide. If you go to www.fda.gov/coronavirus, you'll come to a landing page that includes hotline information, information on what we're doing, the EUAs that are available, the guidances that are available, and opportunities to talk to us. We want to be there to help, and we think this interview is a great opportunity for us to share some of that information.
Thank you. And Bram, final word?
Sure. First, again, the FDA wants to thank you, Ron, for giving us the opportunity to get important messages out. I think Andy and Soma have summarized well that even during this public health emergency, the FDA as a public health agency is committed to working with sponsors and physicians to try to surmount the many problems that all of us are facing. So please don't hesitate to interact with us. You're right, we're very busy right now, but we are a public health agency, and our mission is to interact with sponsors and investigators to promote public health in the United States.
So with that, I'd like to thank to all of you for taking the time. I think I learned a lot. I hope that our viewers also will learn a lot from this important webinar. And all what I can wish you is stay strong, stay safe, and I hope to meet you in person maybe before CRT 2021. It's going to be quite some time from now. But in the meantime, thanks you all, and hope that we can follow up in person.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay
Thank you,
well.
same to you.